So, I'm so delighted to be here. It's been several years since I've been in this neighborhood, and I'm so delighted to share my latest work with you. I am indebted to my fabulous graduate students, two of whom are listed here. Cassandra Sturpe, who is now teaching at Oberlin, contributed a lot of the work that I'm going to show, and also Jillian Herlinger, who is just graduated as a master's student from my lab. I'm going to show some of her incredible work that she's done both in the Gulf of Maine and elsewhere. So I'm going to talk today about the last glacial termination. I am fascinated by ice ages and the processes involved. And when I did my graduate work in New York City, as Tim mentioned, I used to go to the Natural History Museum. And has anyone been there? AMNH? They have these gorgeous murals up on the wall, and there's this sort of view of the Ice Age world that was put together by artist Charles Knight, and that sort of captured my imagination. And the seafloor was also transformed in a big way, and the ocean had played a major role in late Pleistocene ice ages. Many questions remain, however, exactly how we got from one climate mode to another, and that's what I'm gonna discuss today. I'm a paleoceanographer, and I was told to sort of present this to a broad audience. I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what that entails. I and my colleagues aim to identify the trends and rhythms, aberrations in Earth's long-term climate beyond the instrumental record, right? So humans have been, sticking thermometers into the ocean for only so much time, and it's really helpful to be able to extend those records beyond observation to understand how things work on longer time scales. And really, ultimately, we'd like to use those records to understand the dynamics and the drivers, of climate change and how that might impact us today. And one approach that people often take is paleoceanographers aim to sometimes develop what we call benchmarks. So either capturing a snapshot of a particular time, or a certain property, like say sea surface temperature for the last glacial maximum, something like that, or something else. But developing benchmarks where Earth system models can be used to try to simulate different scenarios, different ways of Earth being in different climate modes. So that's one thing that people are working on doing. And given modern trends, modern CO2, modern shifts in our system, ultimately people are hoping to use some of these validated ESMs to forecast future Earth system responses. Of course, there's more, but today I'm going to be talking about both paleo reconstructions, sort of new geochemical records of the past, and also pairing them with some experiments that have been run by some of my colleagues. And I'm going to give you the punchlines right up front. So I'll repeat them at the end, but here's what I'm going to tell you about. We found that the eastern margin of the Laurentide ice sheet, this is the ice sheet that covered large part of North America during the last ice age, was melting during what we call stadial periods. So these are millennial scale events that I'll talk in more detail about. But we found evidence from offshore of vast amounts of meltwater entering the Gulf of Maine during this time period, indicating warm summer temperatures, because the dominant control on ice melt is really summer temperatures, at least in the modern system. So that was one outcome. And then in the Southern Hemisphere, we discovered that intermediate waters from offshore New Zealand warmed at the same time as similar records in the Northern Hemisphere. And that synchrony is important because there's a lot of different mechanisms being considered to explain this launch out of the Ice Age. And some of them predict the whole Earth to warm all at once, and some of them predict asynchronous warming. So it's important the timing is really important to establish. And I'm going to go out on a limb a bit at the end and suggest that the patterns of marine warming that we're seeing align with model simulations that involve the westerly winds shifting poleward and strengthening. So I'm going to tell you all about how I got there. There are two parts of the talk. The first part is Gulf of Maine, and the second part is Southern Hemisphere. Here goes part one. The last glacial termination, what do we know about it? Well, we know, I'm going to show records typically moving from older to younger, and the x-axis is age in calibrated kiloyears before present, that's BP. And the last glacial termination, the most recent one, we know that CO2, atmospheric CO2, rose rapidly in steps, and then has evolved to higher values. And at the same time, mean ocean temperatures also rose over time. This is reconstructed from bubbles of ancient air trapped in ice, and this is reconstructed from ratios of noble gases that respond to temperature, ocean temperature, also trapped in ice. And so we know that CO2 rose and the Earth warmed, and we also know that from looking at isotopes, that changes in both hemispheres didn't behave in exactly the same way. So interestingly, on the y-axis, oh, I have a pointer. I should use it. On the y-axis, shown here, the ice core oxygen isotope ratio is shown, and up means warmer. These values towards the upper portion of the graph indicate warmer temperatures, all else being equal. And what is interesting about this north-south comparison, the blue is from Greenland and the sort of orange is from Antarctica, these reconstructions. And in some periods during this major transition, they behave in similar fashion. And then in some periods, they deviate from one another. So Antarctica warms while Greenland is experiencing intense cold. And then they come back together and then they deviate again. And this has caused quite a bit of head scratching in the community for many, many decades. Well, for as long as these patterns have been known. And so one interesting, there are multiple mechanisms that have been proposed. There's one, there's sort of a idea about heat in the climate system being sort of shunted between hemispheres or stored and then released. There's one out there that's been dubbed the thermal bipolar ocean seesaw. So let's say that 10 times fast. That involves sort of shifting heat between surface reservoirs. And then there's another idea to explain the deviations here, which involves intense seasonality. It's called the seasonality or the Heinrich-Summers hypothesis. And that hypothesis is something that I'm aiming to test. Zooming in on this period, initial deglaciation from about 20 to 10,000 years ago, we split these up into time periods. HS1 stands for Heinrich Stadial 1. It's called a stadial because initially in those Greenland ice core records, it was cold. And so that these isotopes indicate cold temperatures. So that's been dubbed a stadial, even though Antarctica was warming. And then the Younger Dryas, or sometimes also called HS0, is a similar kind of event, but shorter. And they're interrupted by this intervening event, which is sometimes called the Antarctic cold reversal, or it's sometimes called the bowling alley route, depending on which hemisphere you're in. How do we test this? Well, Heinrich stadials were initially thought to be cold periods that punctuated the last deglaciation, but now we know that Antarctica is warming during these periods, and other proxy records are mixed. So these are just from the poles. Records from mid-latitudes are kind of mixed in what the temperature records show. Some of them show warming, some of them show cooling. It kind of depends on the location and then the type of proxy. And so there's a lot of apparently conflicting records out there. But to kind of unite some of these observations, particularly inspired by comparing the isotope records with records of terrestrial glacial landforms. George Denton proposed in 2005 and then kind of elaborated on that idea in 2022, the idea that Heinrich stadials, instead of being year-round cold are instead highly seasonal, with warm summers, which would drive melting of ice, and extremely cold winters. So that intense seasonality would have the effect of, particularly for Greenland, because it's kind of a winter-weighted record of driving that kind of a response. But other records that record summer temperatures would be predicted to be showing warming at that time in the North Atlantic. This is still controversial. This is not like an accepted scenario. So that's why we wanted to see what kind of evidence we could find to either support or not this prediction. The Gulf of Maine is an ideal place to test this, and I'm going to tell you why. The Gulf of Maine rests on the continental crust. It's very shallow. The University of Maine is right about here where that A is, up in Bangor. Has anyone been to UMaine here? Has anyone been there? At least one of you, yeah. And so I work up here, and drawing a section from A to B out into the North Atlantic, there's a boundary between continental crust and ocean crust. And if you actually plot the depth profile, this is vertically exaggerated, but based on real data, here's Katahdin, it's our tallest mountain in Maine. Has anyone been on Katahdin? Cool. So Katahdin is very tall, and the Gulf of Maine is quite shallow. It's shallower than Katahdin is tall, and it's certainly much shallower than the adjacent North Atlantic Ocean. So the relevance here, the reason I'm showing you this is that the Gulf of Maine is a relatively small volume of water. It's relatively shallow. And its communication with the greater North Atlantic is somewhat restricted. I'll show you in a map on a next figure. So the result of this is that it's very sensitive to change. It can be flushed rapidly because it's a small volume, and it's because it's so shallow, it's very sensitive to atmospheric changes. So you may have heard, headlines about the Gulf of Maine warming rapidly. It certainly is. And that's not a big mystery, really, why, but the Gulf of Maine was very close to the Laurentide ice sheet. During the last ice age, during the peak of the last ice age, it was full of ice. It was completely, there was no ocean in it. The Laurentide ice sheet, this is just kind of a cartoon, but it covered a large part of North America, and specifically in the Northeast. It was completely covered by ice, and there was thought to be an ice stream coming out what is now the Northeast Channel. And then there were even parts of the banks that were subaerially exposed. There are even, there's archaeological, work being done out here. People used to live out here. It's pretty wild. And if you core, sometimes you'll find peat or something. So the world was really, really different. North America during the last glacial maximum, certainly, and then that transition was dramatic. Oop. Back. The sediments that fill the Gulf of Maine reflect that history. It was scoured out, perhaps not completely, but mostly scoured out by the advancing ice. And then during retreat of that ice, there was distinct characteristic layers that were then deposited. This is some of the pioneering work that was initially done by Dan Belknap, now emeritus from UMaine, who went out and established that some of the basal layers were very acoustically chaotic, till very deposit under ice proximal conditions, and then grading upwards into proximal, transitional, and then distal glacial-marine sediments. And then the Holocene at the very top is, basically acoustically transparent. It's very fine-grained, and the ice is left the building. It's way gone. So there are these layers that have built up and leave a record of that whole transition and spanning much of the Gulf of Maine. And I'm aiming, I take advantage of building on this prior work, the knowledge of the existence of all these layers, to go and collect sediment to probe them in new ways. And these are core sections. So this was one long core, but it's been split up into sections. But there's some pretty dramatic changes, even just you can see by eye. So the lower sections are this sort of characteristic iconic red brick color, and then midway through the deglaciation, they shift over to this gray. So even just with your naked eye, you can see, whoa, something's happening here. But there's a lot more that you can do. My specialty involves using foraminifera. And these are single-celled organisms. There are a lot of fans of forams here that I've had a lot of fun chatting with. A lot of foram people here. But they're really amazing. I mean, they've been around for a long time, and they're pretty much everywhere in the ocean. And if conditions are right, they're preserved in sediment. So these single-celled organisms, most of them build shells that are made out of carbonate. Many of them do. And then these shells are an archive. They contain information in terms of their trace element impurities and their isotopic composition. They also contain trace amounts of organic matter. They are just a rich archive of information on the growth environment. And there are two kinds. There's planktonic. I'm showing a planktonic one. This one's alive. This one's dead. And when they're alive, the planktonic ones live up in the surface waters, and then when they die, they settle. And the benthics live either on or buried within the sediments. The two main types. In 2021, I got to lead a cruise in the Gulf of Maine with the mission of, well, two missions really. One was to collect modern material to establish calibrations for paleoproxies, to really basically quantify that relationship between modern ocean conditions and the shell composition. And then the other mission was to get old mud so that I could generate paleo records. And we began, we sailed on the Endeavor out of Rhode Island, and we did a big loop all the way around the Gulf of Maine. It was so much fun. It was absolutely fabulous. And we collected a whole suite of different types of samples. We collected water and plankton tows, multi-cores, gravity cores, and piston cores as well. All these different types of samples. And the aim really was to get a paleo record as far back as we could go. There we go. There she is. And who's been on the Endeavor? I know at least a few people. Yeah, it was funny when I got the call from the program officer years ago. He was like, she was my first ship. And he was 30, 40 years ago. But we were out on the Endeavor, and we had a van where we did core scanning facilities, and we were able to accomplish a lot off of this platform. My job on board, in large part, was to stare at the return waves, the image, the sub-bottom imaging that we got for assessing where we should core. And I had done a whole bunch of research ahead of time, and fortunately Dan and colleagues had already been out there and established a lot of the big patterns. But I had to, assess what was underneath us. And my students make fun of me for this, but I always use food analogies because I'm always thinking about food. And there are these layers, like I mentioned before, you can really see it. There's different kind of material that's distinctly layered, like a cake. And so we went to punch through some of those. And as I mentioned, we had different types of coring equipment for different objectives. We did multi-coring to really capture the sediment-water interface to get that modern material that we knew was going to be fresh, that we can use for proxy calibrations. And this is one of those going down. Has anyone done any multi-coring or worked on multi-cores? A few, handful. They're really neat. You drop them to the seafloor, and then a weight is it's triggered basically, and then you wait for the dust to settle a little bit, and then they come back up. So they do a really good job of getting fresh, undisturbed sediment. This is what it looks like when it comes back up on deck. And another type of coring we did, well, with three types, and then gravity coring, which is very simple. big long tube with a ginormous lead weight on top. And then piston coring. This is a gravity core. Maybe. See if I put a GoPro on it. And we had a guest. Charismatic animal. It's the only one you're going to see. Enjoy it. The rest are all single-celled. That was really cool. We were flipping out when we got that video back. So we send this contraption down to the seafloor and bring back some mud. A lot of it. This is one of my former grad students who, she was so excited. Here's her thesis. It's right there, right there on deck. And then we slice it up and bring it back to a core repository. All my mud is now at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. That's where it lives. And then we sample it. You might recognize somebody here. This is Devin, who worked with me as an undergraduate, and then Jill, my master's student, who just graduated. And sampling these cores at different depths. We found a baby clam. We were so excited in that one. But we basically sample at certain intervals, and then we conduct radiocarbon dating at discrete steps to establish an age model, and then we go back in and sample at higher resolution to do the geochemistry, to do the paleoclimate stuff. Jill's core that she focused on was from this location. It's called EN669 GGC40. I'll just call it GGC40 from now on. And it's from this arm of Georges Basin called Franklin Basin. And the reason we chose this site is that it's one of the first places in the Gulf of Maine to deglaciate, to open up, that we think. So it was a good place to go to study the deglaciation. Prior work had established sort of discrete steps. So there's all these rainbow spaghetti. These are ice margins, hypothesized ice margins of where the ice was at any given time. And so it's thought to have stepped back in various steps towards the modern day coastline. And so this is the location. Again, this is sort of where during the last glacial maximum, the ice was all the way out onto the out here, and then it receded back. My colleague at UMaine, Brenda Hall, has been working in Maine for a long time, and she has established some chronologies of what ice was doing during this recession in terms of dating it. She has mapped out various moraines and glacial erratics and other, glacial features. And basically, one of the important benchmarks that we have is this, what we call a Pineo Ridge system. The average age of that whole system of moraines, basically, these are piles of glacially transported rock that are deposited at the edge of a melting ice margin. And then as soon as they're exposed to the atmosphere, they start being bombarded by cosmogenic nuclides. And that has a cascade effect within the minerals that are in those exposed boulders that we can then go and measure. There's a transformation into beryllium-10, and it basically scales with the time that it's been exposed to the atmosphere. So cosmogenic nuclide dating was used to establish ages for this whole system, and it's about 15.3 calibrated kiloyears before present. That's going to be important later. So the ice was, it was here, and then it was here in between. That is a huge distance. And one of my aims was to see if I could establish a chronology or a signal of meltwater from marine proxies within the Gulf of Maine of that retreat. Because the benefit of glacial geology is that it's very direct. Ice doesn't have an agenda. It's not trying to stay alive. It's a very physics-based kind of a thing. It's just ice. It just melts when it gets hot. So that's great. But the disadvantage is that they often are discontinuous records, especially with things like moraine complexes. They're often, you get one benchmark and then several thousand years or less, and then another one. So this is not a continuous record. So one of my aims was to establish that, a more continuous record from sediments. The prediction we started with is if climate during HS1, Heinrich Stadia 1, were characterized by extreme seasonality, so this frigid winters and hot summers idea, we would expect to see glacial meltwater in the Gulf of Maine, right? If it was cold in the winter and then really in warm summers cause ice melt, you know? And so we were expecting to see that. Okay, great. Well, how do we track that? How is it possible without a time machine to track past meltwater input? I've been using oxygen isotopes, and I'm going to give you a very quick crash course because I know there's a broad audience here. So there are two, I'll talk about two oxygen isotopes, so 16 and 18. They have the same number of protons, same element, but they have different numbers of neutrons. And the heavier one and the lighter one behave a little bit differently from each other in the Earth system. The way that I'm going to express these values is basically as a ratio. This delta 18O is simply representing that I'm taking the ratio of 18 to 16 of a sample relative to a standard. And it's expressed in per mil instead of percent. It's per mil because they're really tiny differences. Within the water cycle, there's fractionation between these two. And so what is fractionation? Fractionation occurs when one isotope is preferentially transferred from one reservoir to another. And going back to food analogies again, the way I typically explain it is when I go on a hike with my daughter, she's now 7, but she still does this. We usually have a bag of trail mix, and it's got, you know, peanuts in it, and it's got M&Ms in it. Well, if I start with a 50-50 mix of peanuts and M&Ms, Cora will somehow magically, like with her taking of trail mix, they'll take more, somehow proportionally more M&Ms than peanuts. So if we started with half and half, you know, and she eats some, I come to it, I'm like, where are all the M&Ms? There's only a couple left. So that's fractionation, but of trail mix. So the fractionation happens in the Earth system as well. So the preferential process in this case is that during evaporation, the water molecules containing the lighter isotope of oxygen are more likely to evaporate. And likewise, once it's in the atmosphere, the heavier water molecules containing the heavier isotope tend to precipitate out preferentially. And so on a global scale, what ends up happening is mean ocean value is modified heavily as water moves through this whole system, this gauntlet here. And by the time it gets to high latitudes and falls as snow and then turns into ice, a lot of that heavy isotope has been lost. And so there's a preferential sort of concentration of the 16 versus the 18 in this material. So in this reservoir. And when that melts and then enters back into the ocean, which is very good at mixing itself on, you know, certain time scales, you know, every few 100,000 years, this very isotopically depleted in the heavy isotope, depleted signal material mixes with the ocean water adjacent, and it's very different. You can see it. You can measure it. Today, if you go out in the modern ocean, this is a phenomenon that you can see. The meltwater has a much more, a lower ratio of 18 to 16 than mean ocean water. So that's the key. And forams are so helpful because they were there. They witnessed this. They are my climate witnesses, and their shell chemistry. Imagine a spherical foram. Yes, they are actually some of them pretty spherical. They reflect the composition of the water in which they grow, plus or minus a couple of effects, and then that is also, though, a function of what they take up into their shell is also a function of temperature. So the composition of calcite depends both on the oxygen isotope composition of the water and on the temperature at which they grew. And so to disentangle these two separate influences on the carbonate value, we use an independent temperature proxy that depends only or mostly on temperature. And in that way, we're able to to estimate the original, that composition of the water, which is what we really want to know, because that's what we're after. We're after that ancient ocean property. Here are Jill's results. She worked really hard on this core, GGC40. She spent a lot of time in a microscope. She picked 2 different species of benthic foram. There was no one species that was present in high abundance throughout. So we patched together multiple species, but fortunately there's a lot of overlap. So we feel good about the record. On the top is the age, going from about 17 and a half to 11 and a half thousand years ago. And these are just the calcite oxygen isotopes. So these are the direct, composition of these shells, which you can measure here. I saw your lab today. Wow, it is fabulous. So some of you are very familiar with this. These are the composition of those 2 different species represented by these 2 different symbols. And you can see they're slightly different in range, but there's quite a bit of overlap. One more time. I wanted to point out here that so I mentioned the Pineo Ridge system, that system of moraines on the coast of Maine. The age of that falls right here, right in the middle of this isotopic depletion, which will be important in a minute. Jill also used magnesium to calcium ratios of those foraminifera, which respond to temperature, to generate a bottom water temperature, shown here as BWT, bottom water temperature in degrees Celsius. And she used those bottom water temperatures to combine with the calcite oxygen isotopes to then derive a record of seawater oxygen isotopes. And she's plotting, it's plotted here as relative change. We're trying to reconstruct absolute values, but just change relative to modern conditions. So what you'll notice is a couple of things I'll point out. The earliest part of the record, there's a wide range of variability. You can see there's just this massive range in isotope composition. That actually scared me quite a bit when I first saw it. I thought, oh, what is it? What have we done? What's wrong with this? But I had to remind myself, this is an environment that's really unusual. It's very shallow. It's very coastal, or very close to, and especially during the early deglaciation, this was basically coastal. So there's high potential for variation here. There's a high variability in this period. And then there's a shift to more depleted oxygen isotope values. And that shift, it's hard to pinpoint exactly, but it certainly occurs at some point overlapping within uncertainty with this Pineo Ridge system establishment age. And so the range and variability changes quite a bit too. So it's really wide range of variability and more enriched values. And then it switches to being more depleted and more stable. So what we're inferring from that is that potentially this earlier period, there was more influence from the greater North Atlantic, driving the values to be more enriched. But then there were these pulses of meltwater coming from the ice sheet starting to come back. And then there was a shift to permanent, well, not permanent, they did go back down, but this major shift to more depleted values, which we're inferring as meltwater. And that's kind of what we expected, but I was a little surprised to see such a big change. It's like, this is the whole ocean change. This is bigger than the whole ocean change. So that's pretty dramatic. It's interesting to compare this record of the early deglaciation, this pulse of what we're inferring as meltwater, maybe small pulses and then maybe a larger pulse. It's interesting to compare these with other sediment properties. So I'm showing on the lowest panel here, magnetic susceptibility of that same core. And magnetic susceptibility varies with multiple factors, but in this area, it has a lot to do with, it scales with ice rafted detritus. So the big cobbles, pebbles, lots of glacially transported material, we see it as both like physically, we can see it in the core, and we've been starting to work on quantifying that. And you can see it in terms of the magnetic susceptibility. And once you get out to the Holocene, it's just very, very low because it's all organic. A lot of it is very organic or just fine grained. So the magnetic susceptibility has these interesting sort of peaks, and one of them aligns right with the Pineo Ridge system. And then another one aligns with another record from the greater North Atlantic. This is not from inside the Gulf of Maine, but this green record is from farther, farther in the northern North Atlantic. And this is a record of calcium strontium bulk from Hodel et al. 2017, where they're looking at the anatomy of Heinrich layers in the greater North Atlantic, and they see these two pulses of detrital carbonate. And it's just interesting that we also see kind of an echo of that in our magnetic susceptibility, but that bears further investigation. We have more things that we want to do there. But I think we're seeing two things. We're seeing both dramatic changes within the Gulf of Maine that are influencing that condition. And I think we're also seeing the influence of greater North Atlantic changes showing up potentially in the Gulf of Maine, which is also interesting. So what does that mean for our hypothesis? Well, if Heinrich stadiols were just cold year-round, then it's pretty hard to generate meltwater that way. And so we're suggesting that these data, preliminary data, indicate meltwater, proximal meltwater from the Gulf of Maine that indicates warm summers consistent with the Heinrich summers hypothesis. I think that is supporting that idea. There's a lot more to be done to really confirm that, but we're seeing preliminary support for the idea that when that ice, that ice somehow it had to move from last glacial maximum inland, we're now able to say a little bit more about when that happened, and where that water went, which is exciting. That was Jill's master's thesis. All right, the second part is shorter, so don't worry, we're doing okay. The next steps, we're going to validate and refine some of our paleo proxies using modern material. I'm right in the thick of this right now. We're going to compare these with some sensitivity experiments run by Joel and Russell, and we're going to continue to synthesize these offshore records with terrestrial chronologies coming out of the Maine Glacial Geology Group. And they even let us come. They're paleoceanographers on a mountain here, and we got to climb Katahdin with them, which was really cool. So we got to see how their work is done, which was fun. All right, so again, our observations support the idea of extreme seasonality during the early glacial termination. But what caused this? Okay, so what? Like, what is that? Who cares? Was it global? How's that relevant to modern climate? Well, we move quickly to the southern hemisphere here. This started as his deep roots, this work. I did a postdoc with Liz Sykes at Rutgers. She collected these cores. I'm showing some of the sites here on this map figure, and then along a section drawn from X to Y. This is a cross section. Transect, and I'm going to focus in on this intermediate water depth core. So 79 JPC, it's at about 1,000 meters water depth, and this was worked up by another one of my students, Cassie, who is now teaching at Oberlin. Cassie utilized magnesium calcium as well, but in a different species, in benthic foraminifera. So magnesium calcium increases with bottom water temperature. These are some results from modern calibrations. And when she applied that relationship to down core fossil specimens, this is the temperature record she got from the southern hemisphere. And interestingly, her record goes back a little farther into the Ice Age. So starting at about 25,000 years ago and up to 5, she sees colder temperatures and then a rapid warming from about 18 to, somewhere up to 15. And there's this big jump in temperature, and it stays there, which is pretty striking. Comparing Cassie's temperature record with other records from the northern hemisphere. So these are the things that unite these, some characteristics they all use magnesium calcium or magnesium lithium proxies in benthic forms for temperature. So there's similar archives. And similarly, they also have excellent age control. Like they have either they have a ton of radiocarbon dates or they have, tephrochronology that's really establishing a solid foundation. So they're also really well dated. These are things that unite them as well. And when you stack them all on top of each other, what I'm showing is same time period, 25 to 5,000 years ago. IWT stands for intermediate water temperature in degrees Celsius. And although there's quite a bit of variation, Cassie's record from the Southern Hemisphere in green, the 79 JPC, these diamonds, are shown to be, there's a rapid warming. And then the Northern Hemisphere records, this 26 JPC and then 46, the red and the sort of orange, they warm during the same interval. They warm it within uncertainty at the same time. So what Cassie did, I should have mentioned this in the previous slide, these sort of humps down here, these distributions, she did a change point analysis because it's, when you're looking at wiggles, it's really easy to see what you want to see. So we tried to be a little bit more impartial and tried to do sort of a more statistically robust way of assessing, like, when did this start to change? In a robust way, and they all three of these records start to change at about the same time. So that's pretty, they're like really different places on the planet. They're warming all at the same time. So at face value, these results don't seem to be consistent with the idea of a bipolar seesaw mechanism with heat like being shunted back and forth between the hemispheres. But of course, there's a lot of ocean out there. So it's not, it's not disproving that, but these are behaving in the same way. They're all changing at the same time within, as far as we can tell. And so, with an arrow for emphasis. Up. So what mechanisms can drive rapid warming on a global scale? There are multiple mechanisms, but one that we're curious about because it's really important today, and we suspect it was really important in the past as well, are the winds. And so my colleague, Joellen Russell, who's at the University of Arizona, ran a couple of different experiments. She used a system model that she developed with colleagues, GFDL. And what she's done, it's a very simple comparison. There's one control scenario, which is sort of like modern, and then there's a wind scenario where the only thing that was changed was the zonal wind stress in the Southern Hemisphere. And this was basically asking the question, if we change the strength and the position of the Southern Hemisphere westerly winds, what happens to the rest of the system? How does it respond? So not trying to simulate the LGM or anything, but just changing one thing and then seeing what happens. And basically the colors here are showing that. So this is zonal wind stress anomaly. And this is sort of just showing, strengthening and shifting south. That's the forcing. And then at the surface, so these results are published in Denton, Putnam, Joellen et al. 2021. They found a couple of things in the surface ocean that happened. The Indo-Pacific warm pool expands, and they're inferring that warm water was injected into the Southern Ocean via the Tasman Sea. They're kind of talking about this Zealandia switch, this kind of gateway opening up and enabling warm water to, enter the Southern Ocean and affect processes there. That was their inference from this study. So, but building on this study, I said, well, okay, what happens below the surface? Like what happens at intermediate water depth? So looking at the same comparison, but just going deeper layers with those outputs. Temperature at 1,000 meters in the control scenario, these are those three cores that I showed. And then temperature at 1,000 meters, the wind scenario, what we see, it's hard to see just by flipping back and forth. So I'm going to show you the difference. This is the difference between those two scenarios is shown here. It's a little easier to see. There's warming that happens here, and there's also warming, although less dramatic, that happens here. And again, this is kind of a brute force, like change one thing, change it by an arbitrary amount, and then just sort of see which direction things go. But still, we see warming in all three of these places. So what we're speculating is that potentially that warming that we're seeing could have been caused by the winds intensifying and shifting south. Of course, it could have been caused by other things as well, but that it certainly, at least it seems like it's plausible. Another really interesting observation is that the atmosphere also warmed rapidly in both hemispheres at the same time. What I'm showing in this figure, this is glacial geologic evidence from the terrestrial realm, which shows these are glacier lengths from Khotan Nor in Mongolia, and then this is glacier inferred temperatures inferred from the Southern Alps of New Zealand, and they both rocket back at the same time. You know, this one's northern hemisphere, this one's southern hemisphere. These are small alpine glaciers. These are not massive ice sheets, but they're very sensitive to temperature. You know, as a result of that, they're small and quick, and so this is pretty dramatic too. So both the intermediate water temperatures and the atmospheric temperatures, at least according to these, all shot up during this time period. And the ice in alpine glaciers is very sensitive to summer temperatures. So again, to sum up, I threw a lot at you there. We see melting during Heinrich Stadial 1 in the Gulf of Maine, I think, which, earlier conceptions of that period would not have predicted. So that's interesting. And then we also see synchronous warming at, intermediate depths in both the north and south. So that starts to narrow our possibilities for what drove that. And our marine observations align with model simulations. There's a lot more work to be done. This is very preliminary, but I think it's really intriguing. I think the winds are really powerful and are something that we should really consider when thinking about late Pleistocene glaciations. And how this links to modern climate is the winds are changing now too. They are intensifying, they are shifting south. Since what I'm showing here is a reanalysis product difference between the years 1979 to 89 versus 2014 to 2024. So just comparing those two intervals, this minus that. And you can see the property that I'm showing. This is wind speed at 850 hectopascals, which is sort of like the height of the westerlies. It catches the bottom of the jet and kind of avoids all the chaos beneath it, or the uncertainty. And this is what's been happening. Come on, there we go. They've been moving polewards and strengthening during the last 40 years. And the Antarctic circumpolar current has also strengthened. So, what has happened there? There we go. So there is no perfect paleo analog for modern climate, right? There's just nothing that is a perfect copy of what we're experiencing now. This is unprecedented. However, we can still, understand the important processes. We can still test, what happens to the carbon cycle when we do this, what happens to temperature. And we can explore how Earth's system has responded to different kinds of perturbations in the past. A similarity that exists between the last deglaciation and today is that CO2 levels are rising, trapping more heat in the lower atmosphere and cooling the upper stratosphere. And that has generally the effect of creating a stronger temperature gradient and intensifying the winds. That's a physical response, and that's an important analogy. I think we've got a lot to learn from that. And so what will happen? I don't know. Right now, the processes are kind of duking it out. There's greater wind stress, which drives deeper mixing, but there's also greater melt, which tends to favor stratification. So I don't know what's going to happen, but those two processes are ongoing. In the Southern Ocean, which is really important because it's taken up half the carbon and more than 2/3 of the heat, of the anthropogenic heat. So it's a pretty big deal, and a lot of that action happens in the Southern Ocean. Which is 6 or 7% of the ocean surface area, but is like outsized in its influence on the whole rest of the ocean. So what will happen? I don't know, but we'll see. We will see. I wanted to thank a lot of people for both of these projects that I have shoved into one talk for you. But a biggest shout out to my graduate students and my amazing undergraduates who at University of Maine who have helped to make this happen. They are just amazing, and I'm so lucky to work with them. And they would be upset with me if I didn't mention that they have an Instagram account that you can follow if you so desire. I can take no credit for this. It's all them. But if you want to see more about what they're up to in action, you can check us out there. Thank you.